It is good to be with you all. It has been a while since I've been here in the pulpit, but I have always enjoyed coming to First Baptist and sharing. I've been asked a few times, and my schedule has not allowed me to be freed up, but this is one of the times when your pastor called. I said, yes, I'm free. I would love to be here and be with you, and appreciate it very much. And I remember us going out to eat on that day. I remember that very religious dog you had. Very impressed. You may have heard in the introduction that I live in Atchison, Kansas. I travel from Atchison to my work at Central Seminary, which is in Shawnee, Kansas. And it's about 50 minutes it takes me to get there. So as I travel from Atchison to Shawnee, Kansas, I get to glimpse some of the rhythm of farm life in Kansas. I see the plowing and the preparing of fields. I watch as tractors make rows and plant soybeans and plant corn. I get to witness the green stalks begin to push their way up through the soil. I see acres and acres of soybeans rippling like waves in a green ocean. And of course, come here in a few months, I'm going to be traveling those same roads, and I'm going to be seeing brown corn stalks with the ears that have dropped. And then I'm going to see the combines, and then I'm going to see just the stubble. Well, when I see all these fields and I think about all this agriculture, my mind kind of goes into sermon mode, because I have this time and I think about sermons as I'm driving. And as I was thinking about it, it got me thinking about stories about planting and harvesting. Those planting and harvesting stories we find in the Bible. So this morning, I want us to hear about a biblical harvest. And it's a harvest that goes into the asset side of the ledger as a bumper crop. And it's a harvest that's found in a parable by Jesus. Now, to encounter a parable is to bump up against something that's special in the Bible. If we want to experience the very voice of Jesus, nothing seems more authentic than to hear a parable. If we could have asked the average Joe and Joanna Q. Public there living in first century Galilee, tell us something about Jesus, who he is, they would have said, well, he's a healer. He cast out demons. But most of all, he tells the best stories. He tells parables. He's a great parable teller. Parables were Jesus' most intimate style of teaching and his most cryptic way of revealing the kingdom of God, or as I like to call it, the movement of God. The movement of God is like, and then Jesus would tell a story about a mustard seed, a woman baking bread, a runaway sheep, a lost coin, a stubborn son. So this morning, Jesus reveals the movement of God by telling about a bumper crop. And you have heard the parable this morning about the movement of God. We sometimes consider parables, such as the one that you just heard, as something that is simplistic and childlike. It's a childlike story that's easy to remember and easy to digest. I can understand that. This parable that you heard is only 98 words. It would only be half a sheet of typing paper, double-spaced. It's a simple story, in short. A sower scatters seeds rather indiscriminately. Some seeds don't germinate because of birds and weeds and rocks. Other seeds, however, do grow, and they produce an enormous amount of grain. That's it. Simple. Parables are, however, not simple stories with simple morals. Those are fables. Jesus never told fables. He told parables. For this reason, Jesus begins and ends this story with an imperative to hear. Before Jesus utters one word of the parable, he begins with this challenge: listen. Or as one translation puts it, listen. What do you make of this? And at the end of the parable, Jesus issues a final challenge for the crowd. Let anyone with ears to hear listen. So this whole parable is framed by this great challenge to listen and to hear. So why the focus on hearing? Because when it comes to prophets or to teachers like Jesus, their messages were often in word pictures. Word pictures that speak truth, and you have to be able to visualize, and that's important. You visualize this truth, and the truth that they speak is always indirect. This calls for a special type of hearing when it's an indirect truth. One of my favorite poets is Emily Dickinson. Her poems are often parable-like, and in one of her poems she wrote this: "Tell all the truth, but tell it slant." What she seems to be saying is that sometimes we are best captured by the truth when it doesn't come directly at us. In a movie came out a few years ago called A Few Good Men, starred Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson. Jack Nicholson played the role of Colonel Nathan Jessup, and he gave this memorable line when provoked about the truth by Tom Cruise's character. And you all know the line. You've probably used it somewhere in your own life, somewhere along the line, when that colonel said, "You can't handle the truth." Probably none of us can, at least directly. Truth that is too direct, too bright, too in our face may cause the walls of defense to go up. We need our deepest truths served to us slant, around the edges, at the margins. Jesus teaches indirectly. By the indirection, Jesus causes us to work at understanding parables, figuring them out. Parables become like riddles that tease our mind into active thought. I actually, this morning at the early service, I gave the group there a parable to tease their mind into active thought, and I didn't give them the answer. They Googled. Their minds got in active thought and they Googled. Let me give you a riddle. See if you know what it is. In marble halls as white as milk, lined with skin as soft as silk, within a fountain crystal clear, a golden apple does appear. No doors are there to this stronghold, yet thieves break in and steal the gold. It's a riddle. And you have to think about it, and you have to try and figure it out. That is a parable. They want you to try and figure it out. It's not a little simple moral that is at the very end. Parables cause you to itch, and you have to figure out how to scratch. Jesus tells these cryptic parables because when a person did understand them, when you did figure it out, when you got the idea behind it, it meant that you were joining the movement of God. And whenever you join the movement of God, there's always a political consequence. The movement of God always ran into the obstacle of the political power of that day, Rome. The movement of God challenges the way the world works at any time, and the status quo never likes to be challenged. Jesus' parables, they confront the status quo. In a way, Jesus' parables work a little like the quilts that were made by the slaves in the 1850s and the 1860s. In a book called Hidden in Plain Sight, the author suggests that some of the slave quilts contain codes for helping slaves find and use the Underground Railroad to escape from the South. Quilts would be hung out on the clothesline to, quote, air, and the colorful appliques on the quilts were symbols showing escaping slaves the way to freedom. When powerful folks control all the methods of communication, the powerless create hidden stories. And when read between the lines and around the edges, they are subversive and revolutionary stories. Parables are revolutionary. They're subversive. They invite us to join the movement of God. In our passage, the great crowds that surrounded Jesus, that great crowd was encouraged to hear his simple parable, but to hear it slant as a parable that challenges the system. Mark sets this scene of Jesus' teaching to this crowd by setting the scene of this crowd being a large one. It is so large that Jesus has to get into a boat, push off from the shore to be heard. It was a big crowd. It was the biggest one so far in Jesus' ministry in the Gospel of Mark. And it was a crowd full of people of the land, tillers of the soil, those people who had red necks and calloused hands. These were the folks who scratched out a bare existence from the land owned by somebody else. They earned their bread by the sweat of their brow and prayed each night that there be a little rain, some sun, and that locusts would stay away from their crops. As Jesus tells this parable to the crowd, those folks, they didn't have to imagine the action of the sower. They lived it every single day. When Jesus says that scattering seeds were gobbled up by birds, hundreds of heads would start nodding, going, yep. We know exactly what you're talking about. You toss seeds, you turn your back, and all of a sudden there's a bunch of crows right behind you, eating every darn kernel. Know what you mean, Jesus. Gotcha. Seeds on rocky soil? That caused some of the people to chuckle. Where aren't there any rocks in this soil? There's a story told by the rabbis that when God created the world, that God used angels to help. Angels with bags of trees would go out and plant trees around the world. Angels with bags of birds would take birds and scatter them around the world. The angel that had the bag of rocks was flying over Israel, and it broke. Whenever I take groups over to Israel today, I often have folks who will pick up rocks for mementos, and they'll pick them up and they'll put them in bags and they'll bring them home. And every once in a while there'll be somebody who will ask me, is it okay if I can take this rock? I say, you're more than welcome to every rock in Israel. They want you to take them. There are rocks everywhere. So when this rocky soil, these folks would have gone, oh yeah. Seeds falling on rocky soil, plants sprinkling up, withering, it happens all the time. And then those thorny weeds, every person hearing that parable would have understood an aching back from bending and pulling weeds. But guess what? The thing about weeds is they just grow like weeds. You pull one, turn your back, there are two more. And if you stop hoeing and pulling just for a little while, you can't even figure out what you've planted because the weeds have taken over. The original audience would not be surprised that lots of seeds didn't make it. This was just the nature of sowing. Some seeds make it, some don't. Seed sowers expect failure. It's not surprising. And perhaps that at least is a little bit of what Jesus was hinting at with this parable. Don't be surprised when failure happens. You can plan, strategize, create, and sometimes nothing works out. But we keep on. One writer puts it this way: keep on spreading seeds. Keep on preaching the gospel and showing compassion of the kingdom. In ways we do not know, in places we cannot see, even now the great harvest of God is growing rich and full in the fields. Failure happens and is even expected. But that doesn't mean God's not working in us, with us, through us. The sowing spirit we keep within our heart is ever hopeful and optimistic and keeps scattering seeds. But what's surprising in this parable? The twist that would have captured everyone is that the seed that fell into the good soil didn't just double. It didn't just triple. They increased and brought forth 30-fold, 60-fold, 100-fold. Every person there would have had their mouths drop open, catching flies. They had to be thinking, it can't be. This harvest exceeds their wildest imaginations. It's a fantasy. Jesus' parables were meant to tease people's mind into active thought. So what was going through the minds of those poor tenant farmers, those people there with their patched overalls and with their sweat-stained bandanas? What was going through their mind about this super duper hyper harvest? One word was bumping around in their mind: surplus. Surplus. With a surplus of grain, they could eat without worrying about their next meal. No more children with drawn faces, with ribs showing through translucent skin, who cried themselves to sleep at night because of want of just a little daily bread. It meant they could pay rent on land. They could pay their tithe to the temple, pay off debts, and perhaps, maybe, even purchase the land and end their servitude to masters and owners who exploited them. With a harvest like this, 30, 60, and 100-fold, they would be able to sing in their hearts, free at last, thank God Almighty, free at last. The vision of God's movement overturns the earthly system of exploitation that the birds, rocks, thorns, and people used to oppress the peasant farmer in that day. In this bumper crop, it's possible for everyone to be fed and taken care of. There doesn't have to be the needy or the poor. No one does without. It's a great vision. Jesus is a great storyteller. Of course, it's just a nice story. It's just a parable. Maybe even it's only a yarn, a tall tale. It's a dream, isn't it? Or could this parable stir people's minds to the reality that the movement of God is already in their midst with a bumper crop? As Mark tells the parable, he emphasizes the size of the crowd. It's a bumper crop of a crowd. The people are there. They have it within their powers to live in the movement of God so that no needy person is in their midst. The sower who gathers in 100-fold, or anyone in the crowd who has even just one extra little grain, can share it with their neighbor. Those in God's movement see each other as neighbors, and they find ways of mutually sharing the harvest. In the Old Testament is a vision of what the world could be like and what the movement of God is called to be. It's an old vision, but it's the vision that we have today too. The Deuteronomy writer says, "If there's any among you in need, a member of your community in any of your towns within the land of the Lord your God, do not be hard-hearted or tight-fisted toward your needy neighbor. You should rather open your hand and willingly give to the needy, whatever it may be." In that gathered crowd around Jesus, there would be enough to go around to make sure everyone had enough. The issue for us today is not whether there's enough to go around for those in need. The world that God created is good. It's good and abundant, like the good soil in which the seed fell and produced 30 and 60 and 100-fold. The problem is distribution. The problem is economic hoarding. The problem is exploitation within societies. Clarence Jordan, who had a communal farm down in Americus, Georgia in the 1940s, he understood this problem and gives a succinct God movement solution that we would do well to hear even today. He said, what the poor need is not charity, but capital. Not caseworkers, co-workers. And what the rich need is a wise, honorable, and just way of divesting themselves of all their overabundance. The 1% need to find ways to not be the 1%. The sower in the parable had a great harvest. He had a surplus, an overabundance. The parable is open-ended because the question is, what will he do with it? hold it, hoard it, or share it. Jesus once said that all the laws and all the words of the prophets hang on just 2 commands. I think all the parables that Jesus told about God's movement hang on these 2 commandments also. The first is to love God, and the second is to find ways to love our neighbor. Amen.
And then how appropriate to sing of a bumper crop of love. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus. 477 in your hymnal. As we sing, Brittany will be at the front. If anyone would like to talk to her more about this church or know more about joining this church or to just ask for prayer, we invite you to come. 477. Let's stand and sing. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus, vast, unmeasured, boundless, free, rolling as a mighty ocean, in its fullness over me. Underneath me, around me, is the current of His love, leading onward to the glorious rest above. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus, spread His praise from shore to shore. He who loves us changes never, nevermore. He who died to save us, loved ones, intercede for them above. He who called them His own people watches over them in love. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus, love undying, love the best, as the ocean of His blessing, sweet the haven of His rest. Oh, the deep, deep love of Jesus, Lord of every sea. This my everlasting glory, Jesus' mighty love for me. And now we come to give of our gifts. As you're able, let us give.